Hello, everyone, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Chris Rossini, our co-host. Chris, welcome to the program.
It's great to be with you, Dr. Paul.
Good, and this is Friday. And a lot of times we mention the Federal Reserve on Fridays, and we talk a little bit about economics. But in this day and age, we can hardly talk about the Federal Reserve without talking about the lockdown, and keeping people at home because of a complicated mess that our government has given us. I want to put a chart up here to show a little bit about what we'll be talking about today, because a picture's worth 1,000 words, a chart's worth 2,000 words. This is so dramatic. Just look at this. That line across the bottom is a representation of the number of people who are on unemployment. And something happened just a few weeks ago. There's no gradual disintegration of our economy or something happened there, but this is an explosion. And the way we look at this is that there's a couple causes, and one, the stage is set always for this type of a economic system that we have today is set in place by a monetary authority, the central bank, the Federal Reserve. They inflate too much, they keep interest rates lower than normal, and they create a bubble, and the bubble always bursts. So we've been anticipating, quite frankly, I've been anticipating a collapse in what we're witnessing today, but I didn't know it would be so big and so dramatic. But it's there, and it's explainable. But it's also related. We have the Fed creating the bubble. We know the bubble bursting was coming, but there was another incident that helped this along and made it worse and made that curve a little bit more dramatic, and that was the systematic attack on American liberty to compensate for a very serious problem going on. So the attack, of course, was those people who hyped up the danger of coronavirus. We know there was a danger. We know diseases have been around for a long time. We know a little bit about, immunity. We know about natural immunity. We know about vaccines. And yet this approach this time has not been all that rational. It's been the negative message has been extreme. There is now a message, an announcement today from Georgia Tech that there's a couple million people they're predicting will die by August from coronavirus. And another report I saw the other day, and this is something I saw, not absolutely verified, but it's believable, is that there was a record kept about the number of people who died in January from the flu. And I'm sure that's historic. Every year we have flu deaths, and they've been always far exceeding what we've noticed in coronavirus. But the interesting thing about this, in this group that was reporting it, said, yes, the numbers were pretty high, and they were significant as usual in January for the flu, but they had no deaths from the flu in February. And all of a sudden, we see the explosion of deaths, and we've heard so often and we've reported on this program that doctors are conditioned and taught to get better remuneration if they have patients with coronaviruses, and that they've been instructed, and it's documented, they've been instructed to use the diagnosis of coronavirus in order to get more benefits. So the curve that we showed there is the equation is a bubble Fed created plus lockdown ends up with unemployment skyrocketing. The chart that I had up there says 30 million, but it's already admitted it's several million more, and it will continue to climb. And they will still have more government policies that help create this bubble, like the Fed really created the financial bubble by printing too much money, accommodate deficit spending, and having interest rates too low. So that's how they're going to try to correct the financial bubble. And the main direction that they send all this extra money to in manipulation is to protect the banks and certainly the stock market. And they're in the process of doing this, and the stock market is in the quandary because one day they think, they're going to save us. And then the next day they say, well, they can't save us. Well, ultimately, they're going to realize realize that the Federal Reserve manipulating the stock market and the financial markets with the policies that created this mess, they will not save the people. There will be some who are going to survive. They always do, because they're insiders. We saw statistics this week already that some of the very, very wealthy people in this country, somehow or another, with all this stock manipulation and everything, they made billions and billions of dollars. So this is a characteristic. Sometimes it's malicious and planned, but sometimes it's just the way monetary policy works, that the money never gets to the people, even though they send out checks. They send out $1,000, $2,000 to as many people as they can find. That is not a solution. That's just printing money. That may be a blip. They might feel better for a day or two, but that doesn't solve the problem of getting people back to work. And of course, that's the big deal now. When are the people going to go back to work? And there's a lot of argument about it. But it's very, very serious, because under these conditions and the government acting at least to accommodate the people who are upset will give us more government and less freedom. And that is what's going on. The people are usually the ones who are the victims, the average person, the middle class. That was the case when our government overstepped its bound after 9/11. They created the Patriot Act. Matter of fact, they didn't create it. It had been around. They were just waiting for this Pearl Harbor event, and that was 9/11. And who suffered from all that? There was more suffering of the American citizen with the Patriot Act at airports, and they all contribute to this. And there was a lot of money spent on that, and that's part of the malinvestment. They just created the money, but there was a definite erosion of liberty for the American people since 9/11. And just now, what's happening now, if they essentially can lock us out down and say you can't go out of your house unless you do A, B, C, and you're not even sick and you're healthy. Quarantines have been used for many, many years, and it's usually to isolate people who have a serious contagious disease, and they're quarantined. They're not supposed to go out. And most of the time, people will do this, and they do a lot of it now. I think if they do move in the direction of opening up, the markets and all, people will still do self-quarantine, but there's just no reason why we have to have all these mandates. And matter of fact, we're at a point right now, the pressure from the people who are sick and tired of it probably is prompting a little bit of this lightening up. But the lightening up is going to be very important, because more and more people aren't trusting the government. They're sick and tired of all this. So there's two battles going on. The authoritarians who love this stuff, build authoritarianism and central economic planning and spend money forever and undermine liberties. They have no qualms about it. They have no conscience. If they take away liberty or somebody dies because of these regulations, there's no conscience. And people have died from these regulations. People can't get their regular medical checkup because of this effort to prepare the hospitals for this massive influx. Turns out the hospitals never got overflowed. The people stayed away. They couldn't trust what the government was saying, and people have died. So there will be people just dying from these regulations. They do not want to hear, and they do not believe that free people are capable of taking care of themselves, and they don't need a government telling us every minute of the day what we can or can't do. Chris.
That is right, Dr. Paul, and it did not have to be this way. As Daniel and yourself pointed out this week, there were countries, Sweden included, and 8 U.S. states that went a different direction, not lockdowns. They went in a more free market, voluntary direction, and they benefited from it. The rest of us, we got socialist philosophy good and hard. Lockdown, feeling powerless, isolated, and alone. Your individuality means nothing. It's one size fits all, and get in line. And, we have bread lines now in America. The government is sending money that it does not have. It's rationing it out to people. It's so demeaning, and this all happened because too many people believe that this is the role of government. They've been duped into believing that freedom would create chaos, where it's the exact opposite. Society and civilization are a result of spontaneous order. And that's despite the fact that you say, oh no, there's governments all over. Yeah, there's governments, and it's despite governments. The least government there is, the greater the civilization as a result of spontaneous order. And it's the exact opposite of what people believe. It is government force that creates chaos, government planning that has created these breadlines. There is no, the idea is wrong that a select group of people are able to micromanage, plan, and run the life of everyone else. It's just wrong.
You know, and they'll make mistakes, as they usually do. Sometimes they'll accidentally do something that maybe is proper, but they always make mistakes. We all make mistakes. And you say, well, leave this up to the market and individuals. Won't they make mistakes? Yeah, probably will, and some will do a better job than others. But when the individuals in a free society make a mistake, it's usually very, very limited, and the access to some better choices has to come elsewhere. It has to come from the family or education or whatever. But when you get people like a Fauci in charge of this, and he's a dictator, I mean, when he makes a mistake and scares people, and they have these hysterical reactions, that is pretty tough to compete with. So this is the big problem. When the government takes it over, it makes it much worse. And the one thing that they have done, which is completely wrong, it is known now that those old people, they're more vulnerable, and therefore we understand that. But when they put in the directives to really watch people and lock people up, well, let's say that in theory you are, still in the business of over-regulating. Oh, well, they'd be locking up everybody over 70, but no, they're locking up people under 50, and they essentially never get the disease. So the people under 50, they lose their liberties, they lose their jobs, they lose their income. Oh, but the government will come to rescue. Of course, the solution isn't regulating anybody except somebody who will be quarantined, and most likely by themselves or very locally if people have some really, really contagious disease that you can tell. But quarantines weren't made for 99% of the people who suffer from it have no disease at all. And they have no idea about these statistics because they don't know how many people have been infected, and it was just unnoticed infected. They were building their immunity. It was herd immunity. So we've done everything to prevent that from happening. So we're really delaying the natural immunity that builds under these circumstances from a disease they have never proven is worse than the flu virus. A matter of fact, I think a lot of people is a lot less dangerous. But then again, they say, oh, don't you care about people dying from the coronavirus? Sure we do. We do, but we should be concerned about tuberculosis and the flu. More people die from that, so it doesn't generate all this hysterical reaction. And then in combination with the Federal Reserve, this all costs money, and you have to have a Federal Reserve to create these problems, and you have to have a Federal Reserve to finance the correction of all these problems. And this is both domestic and foreign, because really they talk a little bit about we ought to back away from some of this foreign adventurism. Well, this is a good time to do it, but we're not. We're spending more money. Matter of fact, we're aggravating more countries right now. We're still putting on more sanctions, just looking for an excuse. There will be no cuts. I can guarantee you there will be no cuts in the military budget, and probably no cuts, in the domestic budget. But the distribution will not be fair. The distribution will eventually fail, and even for the military, it's going to fail, because eventually, yes, they can appropriate money. The Fed can print the money. They can spend the money. They can fight these wars, but eventually the money quits working, and it won't buy what you think. And that is what is starting now. And we are losing the status as the reserve currency of the world. We can't increase our balance sheet. It's gone up $3 trillion here since these problems have developed in the last several months. And that's just really, really inflationary, and there's no control of that. Sometimes they say, we'll do that and it'll filter down to the working people. Well, it doesn't. It usually filters up to the rich people, and that is what the problem is when you have a monetary system like that. So if you had to go and say, what's the big issue that ties all this together? Well, it's the monetary system. It's the fact that somebody can create money out of thin air and pretend that they can run the world. Yesterday, once again, I heard the same old baloney from the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, because I heard it so many times in Washington, is that, we're limited in what we can do. That's the chairman saying, because it's you guys, it's the Congress. You're the ones who spend the money, and if you didn't spend the money, we wouldn't have to print all this money, which is a real cop-out because it's a business deal. The people who have the spending and the people who print the money, Republicans and Democrats, they work together very well. That's why you see in the midst of the worst crisis which we've been in, they didn't fail to get the budget passed, and they never fail the supplementals. The big danger now is they don't even have to be in Washington anymore. They can just do it. And of course, the Fed's been that way for a long time. You think they got an authorization, an appropriation for the trillions of dollars they spent when they pretended they got us out of the mess in '08? Well, they didn't even get us out of the mess. They just prolonged it and boosted the stock market. Their goal is to keep the stocks high, but it looks like it's getting more difficult for that too. So, Chris, my belief is that economic planning gave us this problem, and just more economic planning with wiser people in Washington or in the Federal Reserve will solve our problems. I don't buy into that.
And you're right not to, Dr. Paul, because it's the same story over and over again. There are people that reach for the impossible. They want total control. We saw it in the last century, the socialist century, where it was believed that society could be micromanaged by brute force. The Chinese communists said that power came from the barrel of a gun. The Soviets said that if you don't obey, you will not eat. And they created hell on earth. They didn't micromanage anything. And because it's not possible. But, in modern times, we have a new breed of people that they want to try to attempt to micromanage with algorithms, with something called artificial intelligence, which is an oxymoron. These are man-made tools that they believe that they're going to be able to micromanage society. Now, these tools are neither good nor bad, as with all tools. An airplane is wonderful for travel, but an airplane could also be used to fire missiles and nuclear weapons. It all depends on how it's used. Society cannot be micromanaged with brute force or with any type of man-made tool, and there's one reason for that. Every single person on this earth is endowed with individual liberty. We are not meant to be micromanaged by anything. And it's a shame that we have to keep going through this story over and over and over to get to the same conclusion.
Very good. When we deal with these problems and we discuss it here on the Liberty Report, I always, in my mind, try to study and try to understand motives. Motives are important. Why do they do this? Do they think they're really helping people? Are they misled? What is their economic policies? Are they looking for power? And the more I think about the different reasons why they may be motivated to do this, the more I realize there are different motives. The average person who gets conditioned and dependent on the government, they have a motive. They've been taught to be very dependent, and government will take care of them. They'll make them safe. Government's supposed to protect our liberties, but this whole thing about making us safe from the coronavirus is the reason why everybody capitulates. Well, the government knows what's best, even if we have to go into debt by the trillions of dollars. So that motivation is ingrained. Where do they get it? Well, they get it from our university, our professors. They get it by conditioning. It works for a long time. We've been in control of the monetary system since World War II, and we've been printing the money, and we've been benefiting a lot. I mean, we print the money and spend it overseas, then we blame them for undercutting our own businesses. So yes, it's been a tremendous benefit from up, and this is a result of the fact that people believe that it is going to be very helpful. But most of the time, there's always some other people who are sort of lining things up. How do I get power? And you see the aggressiveness now of people speaking out. There have always been socialists. I remember one time Nancy Pelosi accidentally said the word socialist, and it was a mistake. So she had to back off. Today, it is not a mistake when people say, we need more socialism. You win elections now. But that has to be reversed if we want to survive. And I think it can be, because I think that this may backfire on them. There's more and more people now that are very leery of what the government's doing. And I think that's one of the reasons why there's more and more people bold enough to say, hey, this lockdown, why are you doing this to it? Why do we have to be locked in our houses, especially when we're starting to hear information that it's good for us to be outdoors? This whole idea of going to a beach where people are playing in the sun and none of them would be sick or they'd be home, all of a sudden they say nobody can go to the beach, and nobody can be in the sunshine. And then all of a sudden they lock people up, and the treatment that some of the people that are in the nursing homes was unreal. They need a different approach. Not just more pills. And this idea that right now they're working on 100 different vaccines to deal with this problem. Can you imagine the political schemes that are going to go on to who gets to make the vaccine? And by the time that comes out, believe me, there is not going to be, I hope by then they'll be realistic and say, hey, maybe we made a mistake. Maybe some of those people died from the flu, and they didn't all die from coronavirus. But there's billions and billions of dollars now of people lining up, to make the vaccine and make the profits in the bills. So that is so far removed from the type of a medical system that would arise out of a free market economy. When the government pays for it, I'll tell you what, it's a political and economic football, because people do what's best to make their profit levels go. But the whole idea of immunity is not a function of smart people in Washington or the CDC. These people aren't smarter than many others outside. Now, when we come across some people who, boy, they're talking sense. I think I agree with that person. Next day, his video's been removed. Yeah, maybe they didn't have a perfect answer, but they were offering something different. But now, today, the control that exists between governments and Facebooks and all the social media, I think that is one very, very serious problem, because we all believe in freedom of speech. But when it's controlled by the government and for the purpose of the government, and people being sanctioned because somebody's working, putting something on a social media that's really a partner in big government. See, that's a big problem. But message is still getting out, and it's always been that way. Even in the old days, they had to get it out by pamphlets. And fortunately, but I think pamphlets are a pretty good idea. But fortunately, we still have access. I don't believe they can destroy the internet completely. We can get our message out, but the important thing is that people know it and understand it and spread a message, because I think a whole message and a whole philosophy whose time has come, they can't stop it. So I think all the problems that we are talking about today, they can't stop us if we have a message of liberty, and it's something that the people decide, you know what, this government really doesn't come through. They give us wars against countries that we have no reason to be fighting, and against domestic wars that we don't need to be involved in. We need private individuals voluntarily making decisions and solving the problems we have. That's the way it's supposed to work in a free country.
That's right, Dr. Paul. And I'll finish up starting by thanking everyone who watches us or listens to us via podcast. And I want to quote probably from the most American document to ever exist, the Declaration of Independence. It says in there, quote, "All experience has shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they're accustomed." And we see that today. That same principle is alive and well. People are suffering, and they're going to continue to suffer while they can. And you know what? When people in power see this, they're just going to keep pushing. Out of your job, out of your livelihood, arresting people at the parks and beaches when they're walking alone. So but while this is a human tendency to just put your head down and be quiet, it doesn't have to be that way. You don't have to wait for it to be unbearable. You can speak the ideas of liberty now. Sharing our shows, articles, Dr. Paul's books, all his YouTubes, there's thousands of them out there. Just don't put your head down and keep your mouth shut. Now is the time to speak so that others can have a way out of this mess the government created.
Very good, Chris. I just want to close by sort of summarizing the way I look at this, because in one sense, things that are happening are good. Our message is spreading. If you look at the other way about how we're suffering right now, and look at the middle class today, and look at that chart we had, how this explosion, millions of people now losing their jobs, and they don't know when they're going to get back. And they do know that the Federal Reserve can't rescue everybody by just printing a lot of money. So I think what's going on, though, is there's a significant change in politics as well. I was in Congress, and conditions were bad, and it was the economic system and the Federal Reserve that motivated me to run for Congress in the 70s. Things were bad, but, you know, they weren't vitriolic. You know, they people at least talked and they disagreed, but they weren't as hateful as they are now, because I think we're at the end stages of this. They used to argue and fight, and they still do that, and they still agree to spend money for the wars and that sort of thing. But back then it was a little bit easier and not as hateful. But I think now it is recognized that we're nearing the end stages. It's significant. This system is going to change, and now it's turned into political hate. When you think of, you know, Flynn, I don't know much about his personal philosophy, but just Flynn and these other people who were terribly treated during this Russiagate scandal. I mean, we had some bad cops there, and it's partisan, and it's power mongering, but it's turned into a lot of political hate. That is there, and until we come up with, you know, sound economic policies that can be discussed with sound economic policies from the other side and come together. But it's not going to be solved like this. But I do believe our numbers are growing, because I like the idea that when we come across, and we come across, you know, frequently, and we try to get them on our program, and they come from the progressive side. They don't want the wars going on. They like civil liberties. And after a while, after I've gotten to know some progressives very well, they come to understand the Federal Reserve, and that's where the problem is, you know, if they don't like wars, and they don't like all this attack on our civil liberties, then why do they have the right to print the money? So the message is powerful. Liberty is something that should bring us together, because it doesn't mean that we have to agree with what we want to do with our lives. We don't have to have a same social calendar. We don't have to have the same job or anything. We should all come together because we get to make up our own mind to live in a free society and live it the way we want and take our own risk, but also reap the rewards if we act decently and financially soundly. And I think that's out there, and I think I found one thing, that young people are very open to that message. So we all should continue to spread the message of liberty. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.